You're listening to The Back 40, the podcast for Ontario farmers, covering topics and issues that matter most to Ontario agriculture. Brought to you by Trillium Mutual Insurance, bringing the ag community together one podcast at a time. I'm the host of The Back 40, Mike Bryan, agribusiness specialist at Trillium Mutual Insurance. One of the biggest challenges that the agricultural industry faces has always been getting our story to consumers and finding a way to inform various people within the industry what it is that we do and how their food gets from the farm through and to the table there. There's quite a few organizations out there that are contributing to making that happen. Today, we're talking with Carolyn Webb and Nicole Hambleton from Sustain Ontario about what their role is in getting that information and good food to the tables of students in Ontario. Nicole, Carolyn, welcome to the Back 40.
Thanks so much, Mike. It's really great to be here.
So I'm going to start with you, Carolyn. Can you tell us what Sustain Ontario is?
So Sustain Ontario is a province-wide cross-sectoral network. I know that's a big term, but we promote healthy food and farming. So the idea is to work towards strong, productive, equitable, and sustainable local food and farming systems. What that looks like is we try to bring together farmers, public health practitioners, organizations, decision makers, community members, academics, to try to work towards a stronger local food system. We host webinars on different themes of interest. We run working groups. We hold events and conferences, and we share stories and news of what's happening across the province.
So I want to know how the two of you got involved in this. And Nicole, I'm going to start with you. How did you get involved with Sustain Ontario?
Last January, there was a job posting looking for someone to be the Ontario lead. And so I've been working with Sustain since February. I've been involved with food and food education for a long time. I'm actually a nutritionist, and I've been working with an organization called Headwaters Food and Farming Alliance since I think about 2014. Doing farm to school education in predominantly Dufferin and Caledon regions of Ontario.
So what does you said you applied for the role. What does that role entail?
I am the regional lead for Ontario. So what that means is I help schools that have received Farm to Cafeteria or Canada Digs In grants for salad bars. I help those Ontario schools roll out their grants, help them with farm to school activities. And as you can imagine with COVID, there was a lot of creativity needed over the past year to help schools roll out farm to school education programs without actually being in the schools.
Carolyn, how did you get involved with Sustain Ontario?
Yeah, I've been working with Sustain since 2013, I think. So that's 8 years. I came to this work from, I did my undergrad in environmental sciences at the University of Guelph and was really drawn to the environmental side of the work. And before this work, I was doing some environmental policy analysis at an organization in Toronto. My role with Sustain specifically is to coordinate what's called the Ontario Edible Education Network. And so Sustain hosts networks and working groups. And one of those is around supporting children and youth to connect, grow, cook with local healthy food and to learn about their food system and get engaged in experiential food literacy work. So my role is really to connect people across the province doing this work to, and just to support people who are getting kids engaged in experiential food literacy and local food procurement.
So you've been involved for 8 years with Sustain Ontario. Nicole, a little bit less than that, much more recently. How long has Sustain Ontario been around?
Yeah, Sustain Ontario was established, I believe, in 2008. People initially met to talk about the need for an organization that would be a big tent organization to bring together people in conversation. But yeah, it was around that time when the strong talks really developed and funding was secured for it.
Well, this is more based on a partnership. You've talked about building relationships and networks and partnerships on that. That really is what Sustain Ontario is at its core, isn't it? It's a series of networks.
Nothing is done without those partnerships, and it's Yeah, looking to do the work through many different lenses and perspectives and collaborations. During COVID, it's really given some opportunities to work together when farmers markets and community gardens especially were closed when COVID first happened. Sustain organized a number of working group calls and discussions to bring people together to talk about how to be able to open them safely. And so out of that, advocacy work was done. Both community gardens and farmers markets were reinstated as essential services and allowed to operate with strong COVID protocols. We've hosted a number of webinars for community organizations and educators and others, public health folks, to connect and talk about what we can still continue to do in the way of food literacy education in schools. So we've had conversations so far about how to do student nutrition programs, virtual farm tours.
So this has to be quite a bit different from what you were doing prior to COVID. We've all had to make some fairly serious changes, but through COVID, how has that changed from what you're doing now to what you used to do?
I would say for the schools, as you said, it's dramatically different. Many have their big dreams and they're really ready to go, but haven't been able to pull a lot of the pieces together because of COVID, where the kids can't cook together, they can't go on tours, although a lot of the basic food literacy concepts can still happen. People can still learn about farming systems, the different foods and nutrition.
Farm to Cafeteria Canada, they use puzzle pieces. So there's 3 pieces of the puzzle, and the first one is sort of hands-on learning. The other piece of the puzzle is getting healthy local food into schools. And the other piece is about school and community connectedness. And then around those puzzle pieces, we talk about transforming local food systems. So within each of those sort of puzzle pieces, like for example, hands-on learning, then what kind of farm to school education can we provide to increase hands-on learning? And I'd say that was definitely a challenge with COVID. In the past, we could, send an educator in to help a school with a sprouting table, let's say. But that involved a volunteer going into school with kids, hands-on learning. We're all touching the same things. All that got put on hold. So then how did we help schools with hands-on learning? And one thing that came out of the past year was teachers approached me and saying, well, what would be some ideas of things that kids could take and go? Because I heard a story about one school that had purchased some tower gardens to grow hydroponically, and they had just set it all up, and then the school closed. So then there was concern about, how do we get back in and look after those tower gardens? So we brainstormed with that school, and they came up with the idea of sort of a take-home, I'm going to call it a bucket, or a garden in a bucket. So kids were given soils and seeds and a booklet, and it was something that they could take home with them. And then utilizing technology, a website called Flipgrid, where you can use video recording and graphing to then help facilitate hands-on learning. Because I don't think technology can completely replace the connection that humans need, in particular to food and to eating. And I think that having that connection is really, really vital to getting kids to eat vegetables. When you make things exciting for kids, then they're more likely to eat those foods.
I was a cub leader for 10 years, and we'd go on campouts and we'd have parents say, oh, well, they just don't eat this stuff. And yet when it came time for mealtime, everybody lined up, everybody had some, and kids see somebody else trying, and it's like, well, I don't want to be left out. I'm going to try it too. You're going to try at least some of it in order to make sure that you're not the one that's left out.
And there was a story from a school too, where the first Wednesday in October is National Kale Day. So this salad bar was focusing on kale, had different varieties of kale, Russian kale, dinosaur kale, you name it. And again, some kids are hesitant because they've never seen this perhaps, they don't know what it is. And in this case, they had extra bunches of kale left over. It was actually a 12-year-old boy that came and tried kale for the first time. And then he went back to his classroom, and then he came running down the hall later, and he was like, wait, how much are the bunches of kale? I really want to take one home. And it just touched our hearts that we had a 12-year-old boy running down the hall with his toonie to see if he could buy a bunch of kale to take home.
That's not something you see every day. My wife taught high school for many years. She was a nutrition teacher, and she's been trying to convince me of the advantages of kale for quite a few years. I have to admit, I'm not a fan. But yeah, pretty cool to see somebody that excited about something that we wouldn't normally think of people getting that excited. You talked about hands-on. This is more than just a nutrition program. It's more than just an education program. That hands-on portion of it is very, very important.
The experiential piece is so important. It can be a window to connect with local growers, either having farmers or master gardeners teaching about hands-on practices and connecting it back to our food system. But one of the wonderful things about food is it's such a catalyst for learning other skills. By connecting together, students are learning to collaborate and cooperate and feel more of a sense of belonging. And there's so many different curriculum connections and ways to meet a lot of life skills as well, that we kind of say that farm to school or food literacy or food really is about a way of connecting people together, a way of just making learning real for students, and of also helping students develop skills that they'll have for the rest of their lives. So it's really powerful. It touches on so many different elements, and one of the big things is just food connects, and food is a part of our lives, and so it's wonderful to be able to use it to achieve all these other gains.
So I want to touch a little bit on where this all started. How long has the farm to school been going in Ontario?
Sustain has been working on farm to school work since it started. My position was created in 2013 in a formalized role to help support this work. But even before I came, the organization was hosting webinars and working groups and conversations about this. And then Farm to Cafeteria Canada was established formally in 2011. And the farm to school concept kind of came out of the US to help grow the health of communities, the health of students, the connections between farms and schools.
So, Nicole, you mentioned that you had 11 school projects that were on the go now with this round of funding. Can you expand a little bit on that for us?
Farm to Cafeteria Canada has this grant called Canada Digs In, which supplies money for the concept of a salad bar. And that was originally started in 2016 was the first round of grants. So in 2016, again, it was a national program, but focusing on Ontario, there were 21 schools in Ontario that received grant money. And the grant, I believe, is for 3 years. Then the next round was 2018, and we had 11 schools in Ontario. And the latest round is 2020, where we have 10 schools in Ontario. There will be another round we're talking about possibly in January of this year.
Is that government money? Is that private funded? How does the funding work?
That's done through a partnership with the Whole Kids Foundation. Whole Kids is the kind of charitable arm of Whole Foods stores. They have a longstanding program in the United States to fund salad bar programs. And then through Farm to Cafeteria Canada, they've been really excited to expand into Canada. And we've also had some matched funding from the Public Health Agency of Canada, so federal government money for a 5-year project. Looking forward to launching a new round of grants soon, actually.
So one of the things that we often think of for local food is when we're in the rural communities here, we're very close to those farms. Is the uptake on this mostly from rural areas, or do you have a good uptake of this from urban areas as well?
So with the current round of grantees, we have schools, for example, Heritage Public School in Navan, Ontario, which is the Ottawa Carleton School Board, Kitchener-Waterloo, North Bay, Toronto. So we have a good mix of rural and urban. You'd be surprised. Definitely what can be grown in cities on rooftops and in very small plots of land. So we would help schools with that. So I think Ontario has an excellent farming network of farms close in rural and urban areas, and it's just helping schools find those connections.
We've had schools as far north as Dryden, which is near the Manitoba border. They've partnered with a local food co-op called Cloverbelt Food Corp. And we've had a number of schools in Toronto, one of which is Eastdale Collegiate. They have a large rooftop that they've turned into an entire rooftop garden, and have an urban farming program up there, and have integrated that into their salad bar program.
So when you start defining local, obviously for the one school you described where it's on the rooftop, that's extremely local. Some of it, though, I'm sure comes from a further distance. Do you have any sort of a distance that you say, well, that's no longer local to that particular school, or is it just whatever works for that community?
You're getting into definitions here, which can spark a whole lot of conversation because, I mean, we often say as close as possible, but I mean, the province of Ontario defines local as Ontario,
Yes.
and everybody has their own definition. So we go with the source as local as possible. You know, if you can't get a local in your community, then go towards your region or province, and then Canadian if you can't get it in province. Everybody just tries to employ a bunch of different strategies to get as local as they can. But the neat thing is it all looks different for every school, and the connections look different.
Yeah, whatever worked. And maybe the conversation about what is local is more important than actually coming up with a definition, that people do understand that there's stuff that's really close by that you can source, and some of it is further away. As you say, the Ontario government a few years ago came out with definition of local in Ontario was anything in Ontario. That's quite a broad definition when it comes right down to it.
But as you say, maybe the conversation is the most important thing, and that schools do what they can. I mean, Sustain's role is really to support farm to school programs in many different ways, to share stories, whether they're grantee schools or other initiatives that, you know, organizations or educators or farmers are putting on. And so some of what Nicole is going to be speaking to is independent programs from the Farm to Cafeteria Canada grant program, but they're ones that we are equally excited to promote and share.
Do you like what you're hearing from the Back 40? We'd like to hear from you. Send us an email with your comments and thoughts to theback40@trilliummutual.com or follow us on social media @TrilliumMutual.
So Headwaters Food and Farming Alliance, or we call it HFFA, or the kids like to say HFA. We're a local organization that services Dufferin and Caledon region. We started a program again back in 2014 to really think about how can we promote local seasonal food in schools. Born out of that concept was the idea of local food club. It was basically the concept of having a seasonal recipe or meal in a bag. And because of the region we're in, being rural and with a lot of farmland, we were able to source a lot of the food, which we defined as hyper-local, which was within 10 to 25 kilometers of the school. We'd get these calls from parents saying, we're so happy to have our backpack from local food club at home, but I'm noticing like the bread, like somebody ate it. So the kids are breaking into their backpacks on the bus and snacking, which is awesome.
You're talking to the wrong people here. You need to talk to someone a lot closer to the situation.
Exactly. Ask your little friend that brought the backpack home. We would have an education sheet inside that would have the recipe. We'd have a dietitian do sort of a little nutritional analysis on it. And then there was always tips about how to get kids involved in cooking. And then the biggest piece was relating each of the food components or the ingredients in the bag back to the farmers. And so that program now, because of COVID, part of the advantage though to COVID, so we were sad that we weren't right in schools as much anymore. However, it's also allowed us to reach out to the greater community. So now, prior to COVID, it was mainly a program for schools and school children, and now it's a community program. So if you don't have a child in school and you're just excited to eat local food, you can sign up for our program now.
Change is good. Many of the changes that we have seen through COVID, some of them will be discarded because we don't need them anymore, but others will remain as part of the program going forward.
Another really unique thing, because now we're packing out of the food bank, and you also have the option to donate a bag to the food bank. So over the past year, we've actually donated 70 food packs to the local food bank as well. So we're very excited about that.
That's awesome. That's a lot of food. When you think about what a community can actually do to help with those people that have more difficulty feeding themselves, that's a tremendous success story.
And then I'll share about one school, so West Ferris, which is an intermediate and secondary school in North Bay. They have quite a large student population. So there's 325 intermediate students and about 700 secondary students. So this school already has a lot of excellent programs going on. They have their own garden. And so they just wanted a little bit of extra money to help beef up their outdoor garden. And then because of COVID, they had to change that idea, and they came up with the take-home gardening kit. They created a whole bunch of pots with soil and seeds and booklets. The kids took those home, and then they used that Flipgrid program to still communicate with the children and make it now more of a virtual experience while growing at home. And then there's also Heritage Public School, which is in Navan, Ontario. And they received a full grant and wanted to put in a salad bar. And again, because of COVID, that wasn't a realistic option. And so they invested in hydroponic growing towers. And they also did a really neat thing where they had an incubator with chick and duckling eggs go into different classrooms, and they would watch the eggs develop over time in the incubator. And then the school closed. So luckily, a parent took the incubator home and they would film it. So each class still got to see their duckling or chicken hatch out of the egg. And then they went back to the farm. And then that farmer does little check-ins with videos, and they'll, film the chicken in action for the class, which again is an amazing hybrid of this farm into school, but also having to use technology to help us.
Some of those things that we talked about that are going to remain after COVID will continue to use that technology much in the same way, communicate with the students and give them a touch point with what has happened to that particular animal or crop. So what does the future hold for Sustain Ontario? Where do we see this going as we come out of COVID and for the future?
The schools we've been talking to are really itching to grow their programs, to get students cooking again together and serving the whole school with their programs, and bring back that community connectedness and the dynamic element that you see with a lot of farm to school programs. So I think that once COVID restrictions lift, like people finally being able to put their energy again back into these programs. In terms of Sustain's work, we'll keep supporting future rounds of grants and grantees in schools. We'll continue to run webinars for people to connect and share their stories. One of the exciting things happening in Ontario right now is Bill 216, a Food Literacy for Students Act. The bill is all about getting students to learn experiential food literacy in the classroom. And so we have a lot of confidence that it will pass and that food literacy will be worked into the Ontario curriculum. We're really excited that we could see cooking and growing back in the classroom and that students then have this as a formal part of their curriculum. We have helped develop some policy recommendations that were developed as a part of collaborative conversations with many different organizations across the province. We've put forward those to the government. The future also involves, we're going to continue to share stories of how people are making this work. We are going to continue to develop resources and hopefully host conversations and events once we're allowed to do so. Actually, I can share that at the national level, continuing to put this on the federal government's radar and ask if a program comes about and if the federal government provides food for school food programs, we'd like to ensure that that can set local food procurement targets. Brazil has a target of 30% purchasing from local family farms. And so it would be fantastic if we could see some local food procurement targets. The question comes up, how can we better connect schools with local farms? So Ontario has a number of great local food maps that schools can use to connect with local farms and whatnot. So those are touching on a few things of, where we'd like to put our directions. We also, one of the really exciting models that has come out of Farm to Cafeteria Canada is called a learning circle. There have been 5 learning circles, 4 in BC and 1 in Newfoundland and Labrador. And those have been somewhere between 18-month to 2-year processes where communities come together with the help of a facilitator, and they bring together farmers and school board reps and community organizations and public health folks and families and many different folks from within the local food system to set some common goals and figure out how to work towards those goals. So they could be increase local food procurement in schools, or help expand food preparation opportunities, or build some food hubs. Every community will develop slightly different goals, and then they work towards those goals and meet up every 6 months or so to what worked, what didn't, what could we improve upon. And those communities have really brought together schools and shifted those school food systems. Some have led to different purchasing policies within the school boards. We'd love to figure out how more communities can get funded to support some of these learning circle opportunities. Nicole, do you have anything else to add?
I'm excited because October is Farm to School Month with the focus on sort of outdoor land-based learning. And ideally, I think having kids actually connected in person, outside, getting their hands dirty is sort of the gold standard for our farm to school programs. So if we focus on outdoor learning activities for children related to farm to school, to balance the, public health concerns of COVID, but also sort of the mental health and the hands-on learning and the connection, and quite frankly, then the ability to eat more of local foods if we're outside with kids. So I'm excited about that theme for Farm to School Month for October. And then I'll share for Headwaters Food and Farm Alliance, we have what we call our Big Fresh Goal, which is to see farm to school programs in all 50 of our region schools by 2025. So we'd like to help keep rolling that out. So approaching schools and showing them how they can adopt farm to school activities in their schools.
I touched on it in my comments earlier, but how do we shift the system? So not just the amazing things that the schools on their own are doing, but how do we enable school boards to put in place more policies to support local procurement or food literacy? And Bill 216, if it passes, will be fantastic for the food literacy element, but then, how can we support more local food procurement? And a lot of that might be through policies.
It's a lot of fun when you start getting into the schools. Like I said, my wife was, she was a guidance counselor and family studies teacher, and she would get me to come in and talk for 75 minutes on agriculture. It was a lot of fun to go in there and talk to the kids and engage them. This is in Stratford. It's in the middle of some of the best agricultural land that you're ever going to run across. And I would bring in samples of hard red wheat, soft white beans, soybeans, and corn. And the only one that people generally recognized was corn, and the rest of them, most of them didn't know what they were looking at. But Patty always talked about the kids that would come in that many of them had never cooked before. And it was a lot of nutrition, but there was a cooking component to it. And more than one of the parents of the kids said, I'm going to be so disappointed when this course is over, because my son or daughter comes home and they want to cook, and they're cooking the same recipes that you did in school, and they're so good. And I'm afraid that when this is all over, they're going to quit. They always did a final semester end of project where they had to cook something. And Patty said, and I never judged on what the taste was. She judged on how well they did in the kitchen, whether they used things correctly, whether or not they knew what they were doing to combine the ingredients. And one boy made chocolate chip cookies, and he practiced every night for a week.
Aww.
But you'd see kids that they'd make some sort of a dish, like a casserole for supper. And then if they brought the ingredients in, then they just packaged it up and took it home for supper for their family. It was a tremendous experience. The kids loved it. Like, they love this idea of get your hands dirty. It's such a worthwhile experience. It's such a great way of teaching.
Well, and the fun bit is how much else can be learned through it. It's learning so many academic skills as well as life skills and connection skills.
Thinking critically. That lettuce didn't start in the cooler. It started someplace else. And I grew up in an agricultural community. I grew up gardening because my mom insisted that the weeds needed to be pulled and all of that sort of stuff. But people will come out here. We don't have a garden right now, and we have a local stand that you can get corn from. So it'll be picked in the morning. We'll eat it at night, and people come out, and it's like, that's so good. It's so fresh. And it's like, it's stale. I used to go start the water boiling and go out to the garden and get the corn and bring it in. Like, that's fresh corn. So we forget that so many kids don't have a clue on where this food comes from. They don't know what it looks like in the field. They don't understand how it needs to, how it develops, or any of that stuff. And it's such a shame. And I'm so glad to hear programs like this that get the kids involved. So if people want to find out more information about Sustain Ontario or Farm to School, and either get their school involved or perhaps be part of that network to provide support for them, how do they find out more information?
The main ways are through both the Sustain Ontario or the Farm to Cafeteria Canada websites or social media. Twitter and Facebook, and Farm to Cafeteria Canada also has an Instagram account. We also have YouTube channels which share all of the webinars that we've held on different themes. Joining the newsletters is a great way to keep in touch. Sustain has a weekly news about local food and farming broadly, and every month we have a newsletter that just shares the posts that relate to school food systems. At the Farm to Cafeteria Canada level, it's every 2 months or so and includes stories and resources and news. If people join either newsletters, they'll learn about any of the grant opportunities that are coming up. So those are probably the best ways to keep on top of the different opportunities and resources that are constantly being put out.
That's awesome. It's a very important topic, both improving nutrition for students in schools, but also educating them in the process, a very worthwhile cause. We've been speaking with Carolyn Webb and Nicole Hambleton from Sustain Ontario and Farm to School. Join us next time when we'll be talking about a circular food economy, and our guests will be Barb Schwarzentruber and Justine Denard. I want to thank both of you for joining us today, and thank you for being part of the Back 40.
Thanks so much, Mike. It was really great to be here.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Back 40, brought to you by Trillium Mutual Insurance. Be sure to subscribe to The Back 40 wherever you find your favorite podcasts so that you don't miss an episode. The Back 40, bringing the ag community together, one podcast at a time. I'm Mike Brine. Until next time, take care and stay safe.